Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 125. Pandora's Box. Naomasa's shift started at 9 p.m., and as the clock slowly rolled its way past 10:15, he realized he hadn't even been pretending to get things done. Midoriya was Ivy. Toshinori's boy was Ivy. Ivy was a kid the whole time. They were 12 and homeless and quirkless, and gosh, if he had never felt more of a failure than he did right now. Aizawa was due to bring the kid in about 45 minutes, and he didn't know if he had the gall to face him after he had failed him for years. He was cycling through disbelief and debilitating bouts of guilt-ridden acceptance. He needed to pull himself together. He's not sure what he expected to see when Aizawa walked in. He didn't know who to expect, Midoriya or Ivy. But it was clear that he wasn't getting either. He didn't display any of Midoriya's over-the-top politeness, and he certainly didn't have any of Ivy's snark. He wouldn't look anyone in the eye. His gaze never left his feet, and despite the warm air, he wore an oversized hoodie with the cuffs of the sleeves balled up in his fists, covering his hands completely. He looked terrified. He didn't hear a peep out of the kid all the way back to his office, and as the three of them sat down, it felt wrong to break that silence. Thankfully, Aizawa had no such reservations. "You're going to need to talk, kid," he said in a gentle but firm tone. Midoriya just glanced up at him and nodded before fixing his gaze back onto his dirty shoes. He continued not to speak, so Aizawa shot Naomasa a look and nodded his head toward the kid, prompting him to start. "I'm assuming Aizawa debriefed you about our meeting earlier this evening," he started. Midoriya nodded again, eyes still trained downward. He really wasn't going to make this easy, was he? Naomasa supposed he wasn't owed that, but it would be nice to have something to work with. "Right, let's just get this over with then. I already know the basics, but I'll pretend that I don't. I'm going to record this conversation for the record, so don't say anything about Ivy or anything else incriminating. Got it?" Another nod, eyes still down. "You're going to need to answer verbally for the recording, Midoriya," he warned. He nodded again. Fighting the urge to sigh, he gave one final warning about everything from here on out being on the record before he pressed record. Detective Tsukauchi, interviewing Midoriya Izuku with the pro hero Eraserhead, Aizawa Shota. Before we start this interview, I must state that my quirk is called Lie Detector. It is as it sounds, and it is always active. If you lie, I will know. Do I have both of your consent to continue? Yes, Aizawa answered readily. Yes, Midoriya added. Thank you. Eraserhead, please state your report. I found Midoriya on my patrol on the upper north end of Mustafu well past curfew. I insisted on taking him home to inform his mother of his whereabouts, to which he informed me would not be possible as he does not have a home and hasn't seen his mother in 4 years. His mother packed her things and left just before his 12th birthday. Shortly after that, he got an eviction notice, and he has been living on the streets since, Aizawa stated clinically. With each word, Midoriya shrank in on himself further and further. He was sitting hunched forward with his chin pressed to his chest and his hands shoved under his legs that were propped up on his tiptoes. True, he said with no emotion, even though inside he was furious. Midoriya, is Eraserhead's account of events factual? Yes, he choked out. Naomasa wanted to put every single case he had into a fire and spend every waking moment dragging that witch of a woman to justice. He was too close to this case. They were all too close to this case, but it's not like they had any other options. True, he said flatly. What about your father? He continued. He works in America. The boy replied with no emotion. Naomasa hesitated, glancing at Aizawa before responding, That's a lie? That's what my mother told me, he justified. True, but you don't believe her. No. Why's that? He left after fight when I was 7 and never came back. I haven't heard a thing from him since. He fumbled out an explanation. So you think he left because of the fight with your mother? He asked to clarify. The kid made no move to answer his question. After a few tense seconds, he shot a glance towards Aizawa, but he seemed to be waiting for an answer just as much as Naomasa was. A few more seconds ticked by before Aizawa spoke up. Kid, he prompted. Midoriya just shook his head. All right, we can come back to that. Do you need a minute? He asked in a tone more gentle than Naomasa had previously thought the man capable of. Midoriya shook his head again and let the smallest amount of tension out of his shoulders. That was concerning. They were definitely going to have to come back to that. All right, that's okay. If you need to take a break at any time, just say the word, he added before continuing. You said your mother packed everything before she left. Are you certain she left of her own volition? You don't suspect something may have happened to her? It's possible, Midoriya conceded, but he didn't seem to believe that was truly the case. Why didn't you report her missing then? I didn't want to be put in this system, and she packed all her clothes and bedding and her toiletries, her jewelry, everything. She took things of no value to a thief. She didn't want to be there anymore, so she left, he replied, shakily, looking up at him for the first time. He didn't need his quirk to see the resigned belief in Midoriya's eyes. Whether Midoriya Inko abandoned her son or not, he surely believed that she did. Now Masa preferred when the kid was looking at the floor. The empty, exhausted expression he wore did not suit a face as young as his. True. Did she display behaviors prior to her leaving that would have indicated her intentions? Yes, he stated simply. Mercifully, he returned his gaze to his lap, but he didn't offer any elaboration on his answer. True. Behaviors such as, he prompted. For the second time, the kid made no move to answer his question, and for the second time, Naomasa looked up to Aizawa to see if he had any sort of insight to offer. His face remained indifferent, but he was sure that was just an act. He'd seen how frazzled he had been just a few hours ago, but he was doing a remarkably good job of hiding that in front of the kid. Did she abuse you, Midoriya? Aizawa asked rather bluntly. Midoriya cringed at that and took a moment before responding. Define abuse. Did she physically harm you? Hit you? No, Midoriya replied immediately. True. Now Masa interrupted for the record. Should she yell at you or belittle you verbally? Aizawa pressed on. The kid took a little longer to respond to that. It had been 4 grueling years for him, so he could excuse him having to think a little harder to drudge up the memories. Not often, he eventually decided. True, he interjected. Did she deprive you of basic necessities, food, water, clothes, bathroom access, things like that? Aizawa continued. Midoriya paused again to think about the question, and that didn't sit right with him. You tend to remember that kind of thing. As the seconds passed by, it was seeming more and more like the answer was going to be yes. Define deprive? Oh, hell. Did you have your necessities met before she left? Did she give you food and clothes? Technically? What do you mean, technically? She left money. The room was quiet For a moment after that, Naomasa exchanged a charged glance with Aizawa. Left money. Was she not home with you? Aizawa broke the silence. No, not usually, Midoriya replied hesitantly. How often did you see her? Aizawa asked after taking a subtle, calming breath. When? When was the time before last you saw her? How long was that time period? I don't remember exactly. An estimate is fine, Naomasa butted in. Maybe a month, Midoriya guessed. A month? A month? She regularly left an 11-year-old alone for a month? He saw Aizawa's eye twitch. That was all true. How long had she been so absent? Naomasa took back the reins, giving Aizawa a moment to collect himself. Um, I don't know. He trailed off, and Naomasa could see that he was subtly shaking. That was enough. He clicked off the recorder without bothering to ask the kid if he needed a break. He clearly needed a break. No one asked him about it as he got up. The room remained quiet as he filled a coffee mug up with water, brought it over, and set it down on to Midoriya's right. He did his best not to look at the kid, to give him some semblance of privacy, but he couldn't help stealing a glance. He looked so small. He looked nothing like Ivy. Ivy was larger than life and never afraid. Ivy was too slippery to get a hold of, too mysterious to be bogged down by a broken home or the lack thereof. Ivy wasn't real. Now, Masa had known that in a distant sort of way all along, but it was another thing entirely to confront it head on. Ivy was a man, or, well, a boy, just like the rest of them. Shota was beyond irate. He didn't have the words to describe how angry he felt in that moment. He hoped for Midoriya Inko's sake that she had been kidnapped or killed in a hit and run or something equally horrible, because when he got his hands on her, she was going to wish that's what had happened 4 years ago. No, he was a hero, not some psychotic murderous vigilante. He was a hero, and this kid needed him to be calm right now. He needed to be calm right now. He was thankful Tsukauchi knew him well enough to pick up his slack, even if he was sure that whatever the kid's answer to the next question was would piss him off even more. He was right. Even the kid's lack of an answer had his blood boiling. How long had he been alone if he was too upset to even answer that question? Years? Shota had a sneaking suspicion that his mother had started slacking off around the same time his father abandoned them. It didn't excuse her behavior in the slightest, but it made sense. If her spouse left her, he could imagine the home he abandoned and the son he fathered would bring up some sour memories for her. The click of Tsukauchi turning off the recorder echoed in the quiet room, and as he left to get the kids some water, Shota turned his attention back to Midoriya. He felt out of his depth. He had helped this kid through a panic attack probably about a half dozen times in the last few years, but everything was so different now, and he didn't know what to do. That's probably exactly what the kid was thinking too, though. Maybe what he needed was for Shota to act like nothing had changed, to give him some semblance of solid ground when everything was falling apart. Not allowing himself to think about it too much, he walked over to Midoriya and knelt down in front of him. He flinched when Shota reached out his hand and set it on his shoulder, but it seemed like it was more of a knee-jerk reaction than the desire to not be touched, so he held strong. He could barely hear his breaths, but it sounded like he was stifling hyperventilation, like he was too afraid to make even the slightest sound. Midoriya, you need to breathe, he reminded him quietly. He got a single, lurching inhale in response. Come on, kid, halfway there. But you gotta breathe out, too, he joked, trying to lighten the mood. He let out all the breath at once as a scoff of laughter. It was quiet, and his split-second smile looked more like a grimace, but he would take what he got. That's good. Keep going. He gently grasped the kid's left hand in his right and guided it to his chest. Follow my breathing, he instructed as he took deep, exaggerated breaths. He did his best to follow his lead for a while, forcing shuddered breaths in and out. He was making good progress when all of a sudden he just stopped. He took a sharp intake of breath and held it. The hand that was pressed to Shota's chest curled into a fist around his jumpsuit, and the slight shaking of his form spiraled into full-body tremors as he collapsed in on himself. He buried his face in his knees, and his shoulders shook as silent sobs racked his body. Shota was getting so tired of feeling his heart break every 5 minutes, but he had a feeling that wasn't going to stop anytime soon. He did his best to keep his breathing steady as he pulled Midoriya against his chest. He wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do, but the kid followed without complaint, so he figured it wasn't wrong. Vivisection would be more comfortable. Izuku was sure of it. He felt like he had misplaced his grief 4 years ago and was just now stumbling upon it again. It was like no time had passed at all. His mother's absence was a gaping wound that was being studied in a surgical theater by clinical hands. He needed them to stop. He needed it all to stop, but it was like a dam had been released. There was no boarding it back up until the water had run its course. He couldn't breathe. He felt so small. He felt like he was 7 years old again, helpless and staring down at his father's wrath. He felt arms wrap around him and a hand rubbing gentle circles on his back, and he did his best to focus on that before he lost himself. Those hands were safe. But he had thought he'd been in safe hands before, only to be dropped. No, those hands were safe. They had to be. They had to be safe. Please, Kami, let them be safe. Something had flipped in Midoriya. His gentle tremors and anxious fidgeting had started to calm down for a moment with Aizawa's help, and then something just snapped. Naomasa wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. People tend to break down when they're finally safe, when they finally have a moment to realize all that had happened to them. It was the first step toward healing, but that knowledge never made it easier to watch. He should call a social worker. They were out of their depth, and the sooner they could get this poor kid home, the better. He excused himself quietly to make the call in the hallway. The call was over all too soon, and a selfish part of himself didn't want to go back into his office, didn't want to have to hear the kid struggling to breathe against the weight of his grief. But he wasn't the one hurting right now, so he slipped back inside and shut the door behind himself. Not much had changed in the scant few seconds it took for him to make the call. Midoriya was still shaking with silent sobs, with his face buried in Aizawa's shoulder. The man himself was definitely looking worse for wear, and Naomasa couldn't blame him. His lips were pursed in a straight line, and his eyes had gone a bit glassy, which was an observation that he politely ignored. This was a nightmare. It felt wrong to leave, but it also felt wrong to stay. He felt like a voyeur peeping in on a moment that he wasn't meant to see. So he turned his attention to his computer and started pulling up the paperwork that was going to need to be filled out. The sound of the printer whirring in the corner drowned out Midoriya's stifled sobs for a moment, but eventually it quieted, and his ears were once again invaded by the heart-wrenching hitched breaths of the boy whose life was falling apart in his office. He tried to busy himself with looking up Midoriya Inko in the system, but as was to be expected, nothing came up. The woman had been walking around with a clean record for over 3 years after abandoning her son. That was going to change tonight. He couldn't wait to start a file on her. But he was going to have to. There were more pressing matters at the moment. Midoriya seemed to have started calming down, but it was difficult to say for sure as he was so quiet. He gave them another minute as he searched the boy's father, Midoriya Hisashi, if the paperwork Midoriya had filled out for UA was to be believed. Naomasa hoped very desperately that the paperwork Midoriya had filled out for UA was not to be believed. Midoriya Hisashi had several charges on his record, from public intoxication to illicit drug possession. But the most important detail of his file was a death certificate. A death certificate from 4 years ago. Damn it. This wasn't painting a pretty picture. The report said he died in Tokyo, overdosed on heroin. His next of kin was listed as one Midoriya Izuku, who left her son shortly thereafter. Great. That was just great. A woman falls in love with an addict, has a kid, loses her lover, neglects the kid, but sticks around just enough to be there should he ever come back. And when he doesn't, she abandons the boy completely. Sounds like a real stand-up family dynamic. Jeez. His father was dead, and he, more likely than not, had no idea. How the hell was he supposed to tell him that? Not now. Not tonight. There was too much going on tonight, and he didn't need anything else piled on his plate. Freaking hell. Naomasa pressed his palms to his eyes and behind the limited privacy of his computer monitor and took a deep breath as quietly as he could. Hopefully, the social worker had a better idea of how to handle this, because there had been very few cases in his career that were this messed up and the victim still alive to endure it. How is this kid still alive? A hushed conversation pulled him from his internal crisis. Midoriya seemed to have calmed down enough to communicate to some degree, which was good, because the social worker was due to arrive any minute now. Aizawa was still knelt in front of him, but Midoriya's face was no longer buried in his capture weapon, and from the brief glimpse Naomasa caught, he looked shell-shocked. He didn't know what to do, but he did know that bringing someone else in wasn't what the kid was going to want. Unfortunately, neither of them were social workers, and needs must. It would be better not to make him repeat himself. At the very least, he could brief whoever was coming before they came in, or brief them as much as he could. He didn't know if the thought of adding another person to his audience would set him off again or not, so he just texted Aizawa his plan before taking his leave. End of chapter.